Welcome, everybody. My name is Mary Day. I'm a staff attorney at HERA, and I help consumers that are trying to manage their student loan debt, and also homeowners who either are struggling with their mortgage payments or have had a home improvement that didn't go well. And again, if you do have questions, please save those to the end, and I'm happy to answer questions as we go through once we're finished with the slides. My focus will be once you have student loan debt or you're about to take on student loan debt. It kind of overlaps with what Daniel was saying in terms of choices in what kind of debt you take on. Next slide, please. People may or may not be aware, but student loan debt has lately become a very high burden for consumers. That's changed over the course of years. In the 1960s, student loan debt was not so high, but currently it really impacts people who graduate from school and how they are able to function and manage their lives, because student loan has become such a huge proportion. Next slide. These are just some examples of the burden that student loan borrowers experience. Currently, there's about 1.6 trillion people out in America who are having the burden of student loan debt. It primarily affects people of color. For example, people who went to college in 1995, 1996, who were Black, they still owe 95% of their student loan debt. The other issue is that some of the predatory bad loan actors do target people of color, people of lower income. You can see that people that graduate, currently it's 70% of the people that graduate are in debt when they graduate. And it does, in fact, affect people who are seniors, people who are 50 and older. They own 22% of the current student loan debt. Next slide, please. And some of the consequences of having a student loan debt is that it affects your ability to own your home, and it affects your ability to start your own business. There's positions where you can get yourself in where they're actually taking money from your earnings. It'll affect your credit score if you have difficulty paying for your student loans, and it can ultimately affect your plans for retirement. You may have to delay retirement, or you might not have the retirement that you hope to because of the student loan debt. Next slide, please. Okay, this is kind of a roadmap of what we're going to do. I'll first go over overview and types of student loans. I won't go into such detail because Daniel did cover it, and I think we have pretty much the same audience. And again, feel free to ask me questions at the end. Next slide. So as Daniel mentioned, there's essentially two paths. There's the federal loans that are offered by the federal government, and then there's also private loans that come from schools or institutions or banks or credit unions and such. As Daniel mentioned, the federal loans have various protections. I won't go into describing the particular type of federal loans, but I will go into some of the benefits of the federal loans that Daniel was not able to get into. If you want to know more about what type of loan you have, though, you can go to the studentaid.gov website. That's kind of the go-to. There's a link at the bottom, and all you have to do is register, and you have your own little dashboard, and there's lots of data that's specific to you, as well as you can get general information there. The way to discover what your private student loans are is to look for your credit reports. Currently, until the end of 2024, you can get free credit reports once a week at annualcreditreport.com. And you can check all three of your credit reports: Experience, TransUnion, and I forgot the third one, but you can get all three of them for free right now. And you might want to look at all three because sometimes they don't all report the same information, but that's where you'll find the debt you owe to your private student loans. Next slide, please. Okay, so it's kind of complicated, the whole student loan debt. Unfortunately, the federal government recognizes that, and they're trying to reduce it, but there's three different players. There's the lender. Those are the people that actually gave the money to you so that you could fund your education. And there are several different types of lenders: the Department of Education, and then there's the actual private lenders. And then there's an in-between one, which is called a guarantee agency. Those are people who are working with the Department of Education to manage your student loans. And then what happens is there's servicers. Those are the people that you as a borrower actually work with. Those are the people that you make payments to. Those are the people that you reach out to if you have questions. I kind of use the analogy that it's almost like walking in a bank. The servicer is like your bank teller who you talk to, withdraw money from, and the lender is the people who have all the money in the bank vault. If you go into collections, you may have interactions with the debt collector, and those are people that are now totally mandated with enforcing the debt. They're not really trying to work with you so much as they just are trying to get that debt collected. Next slide. Okay, now I'm going to be talking about what you may have heard about, which is called the payment pause, and that affects federal student loans. Next slide, please. Okay, currently there's a payment pause that will be ending at the end of this month. What that meant was if you had federal student loans, you didn't have to be making any payments. But I put this as a warning because that is ending. And what that means is beginning September 1st of this year, your interest will begin accruing. During the payment pause, they were not adding interest to your debt. And that what will most borrowers will be seeing you should have by now, or you will be getting letters from your servicer telling you that you'll have to start making your payments back on your federal student loans starting in October. Next slide. All right, now I'm going to be talking about when you're having difficulty paying for both your federal and your private student loans. Next slide, please. Okay, the federal loans, as Daniel already mentioned, there's plenty of opportunities of how to manage your student loan debt. You can either just pay the payment that you are asked to pay, and that's the standard repayment. You can also have a balance-based repayment plan, which means it's based on how much money you owe. You can also get into an income-driven repayment plan, which looks at your ability to pay the student loan debt and then comes up with a monthly payment that should be helping you make that payment. And that could even mean a $0 payment. So it doesn't mean that you're always going to be paying money out of your pocket, but the income-driven repayment, they look at your ability to pay, and then they will calculate what is a reasonable amount for you to pay. And I'll go into that in detail. There's also, as Daniel mentioned, federal debt consolidation. So you can take many of your student loans and consolidate them into one loan, which I'll talk to you later about why that might be a benefit to you. And then the final way is what they call a statutory discharge. So people who meet certain conditions, such as you're totally disabled, or your school made a promise to you, which was actually a lie, there's a scheme by which the federal government will allow you to discharge your student loans. And we'll talk about that in detail further along in the slides. Next slide, please. Okay, this is a very complicated chart. Don't mean to overwhelm you, but this is all of the different possibilities for paying back your federal student loan debts. And again, I want to emphasize these are federal student loans. So currently there's several different ways that you can get into what they call the income-driven repayment plans. They're basically based on whether they're going to be looking at how much of your discretionary income. What is discretionary income? So currently the discretionary income is based on the federal poverty limit. And right now that's 150% of the federal poverty limit. However, there's a new plan that the current federal administration just came out with called SAVE. That stands for Saving a Valuable Education. That's actually going to be having your discretionary income has to be an income that's above 225% of the federal poverty level, which is a huge boost. And each of these plans have a certain period of time in which they expect you to pay off the loan. And at the end of that period, whatever debt is remaining, it gets canceled. So what's really nice about the SAVE plan is the idea is that's going to be a 10-year repayment plan. Most of the current repayment plans now either have a repayment plan of 20 years for undergraduate loans and 25 years for graduate loans. So those are a little bit longer. And but all of those mean that at the end of that payment period, whatever debt, even if it's 100,000, you're not going to have to pay it off. It gets wiped out. There's also other payment plans, like I said, that are based on the total amount due, what I suggest for everybody, and you should do that frequently because the federal government is constantly trying to improve the repayment plans. But I would suggest you immediately go on to studentaid.gov and do a loan simulator. It takes about 10 minutes. You need to just put in your basic income information, and it'll come up with what they think is the ideal plan for you to pay the least amount total over the life of the loan. And I would do that every 6 months or so, just because there's so many plans that are being developed by the federal government, and they will change over time, including the SAVE plan that has a rollout now, but in July of 2024, there's even going to be more benefits associated with that SAVE plan. Next slide, please. Okay. In addition to those other plans, there's what they call the income contingent repayment plan. That's the least attractive plans, but the reason why that plan exists is because it's helping those people, as Daniel mentioned, that have the Parent Plus loans. Those are parents that actually took out loans for their children. It is the only repayment plan available for that particular loan. There's also income sensitive repayment plan that's only for the FEL loans. Those are the family educational loans that no longer are provided for, but there are lots of people out there that have debt that's associated with FEL loans, and the income sensitive repayment plan is the only repayment plan available to them. All right, next slide, please. Okay. Sometimes when you're struggling to make payments on your federal student loans, you can be put in deferment, and you can also put into deferment with your private student loans, but generally that's not offered, but occasionally they do. With the federal student loans, during a period of time where you're in deferment, meaning you're not making payments, with the federal student loans, those subsidized student loans that Daniel mentioned, those are the ones that they don't have you pay interest while you're in deferment. That means you don't have your interest that is accruing being added to your basic principal. So for example, times of a deferment with the federal student loans are while you're in school. So if you're in school trying to get your degree, the student loans that you owe for the federal loans, you're not going to be adding interest to your principal. Also, if you go into a deferment after you graduate, that also is a period for subsidized loans that you do not get interest added. However, with unsubsidized loans, during any period of deferment after you graduate, the interest gets added to the principal and then it gets capitalized. What that means, capitalized means that every time it gets added, then you start getting interest rate, not only on the principal, but all the interest that was added to that principal. So it's this runaway effect where you can actually find yourself making payments on your loan, but your loan is getting bigger and bigger over time. And that's why you want to look at one of those income-driven repayment plans, because it can help you manage the fact that you're going to be capitalizing your interest and help you get out of those loans faster so that you're not having this loan that just continues balloons and becomes impossible to manage. If you are in a deferment, just keep in mind that the reporting to the credit reporting agencies, you will not be considered to be in default. And so that means that there should be no debt collection efforts or any lawsuits against you while you're in deferment. And that can be an advantage. And that is, again, that's only for federal loans. You can get more information on the studentaid.gov website, and I provided a link. However, as I will discuss later, really deferment is not something you should look at long-term. It should be looked at as just sort of an emergency situation. You know, let's say, you know, you lost your job, but you think you're going to get a job in a month or so. You might consider deferment, but generally the income-driven repayment plans are a better option rather than deferment. Next slide, please. Another way of managing your student loan debt where you don't have to make payments is forbearance. Again, that should be considered a temporary period of time. And what that means, it's very similar to deferment. It means that you're not going to be having to make payments. You won't be considered to be in default, but you will having that interest accrue. And like I mentioned before, then you get that capitalization, which causes your loan balance will definitely increase during the time that you're on forbearance. And again, that's why you want to consider looking at those income-driven repayment plans by going to the studentaid.gov loan simulator. Next slide, please. Okay, if you don't make payments on your student loans, both federal and private loans, that's a dangerous situation. With the federal government does not consider you in default until you've missed 270 days of payments. And if you do go into default with the federal loans, they can refer you to a debt collector. Also, with federal loans, once you're in default, the government can automatically take any tax returns that you might get. Any rebate that you might get for your tax returns, they can just automatically swoop it up and you never see it in your bank account. You can also have some of your wages, your earnings garnished up to 15% of your disposable pay. And again, that's just automatic. The federal government has the ability to look at your wages, take the money before you even get it in your bank account. They can also, any federal benefits that you might get, except for SSI and veterans benefits, you could get those also garnished up to 15%. And the federal government will report you as in default to the credit bureaus, and that will affect your credit score. Also, currently, while you're in default with federal student loans, you cannot make any, you cannot ask for any new loans. So let's say you're default and you decide, well, I really need to change careers, I need to go back to school. You will not be able to get any federal student aid while you're in default. And while you're in a deferment or forbearance, you won't be able to get into a repayment plan. Next slide. So what do you do if you're in default? What do you do if you find yourself in default? Currently, the federal government offers two different pathways to getting out of default, getting current, getting your credit score corrected, getting back into the ability to make payments. One path is called rehabilitation, and the other path is consolidation. Rehabilitation is a little bit more lengthy. What they want you to do is they want you to reach out to the studentaid.gov. You get into a temporary plan. They see if you're able to continuously make 9 months of payments over the course of 10 months. And if you're successful, they take you out of default. You should then immediately look at an income-driven repayment option to see then now what can you afford now that you're out of default. Okay, the other option, if you find yourself in default, is consolidation. What that means is you basically essentially refinance your federal student loan. So you get all your loans, you put them in one new loan with a new interest rate. It most likely will increase the period of time that you have to pay back on your loan. So before consolidation, maybe you had another 10, 15 years to go to be completely repaid on your student loan. If you consolidate, that's likely to be extended because they have to figure out some way for you to pay back the amount of money that you haven't paid them over time. And once you've consolidated again, you do want to look at those income-driven repayment options to get on an affordable plan to avoid default. Now, currently, you can only choose one of these options once over the life of your federal loan. So once you have rehabilitated, you won't have that option in the future if you get into a situation where you're needing to get out of default. And that's same with consolidation. You only have a one-time option for each of those paths. Once you do that, you can never do that again with your federal student loans. So be very careful when you make that consideration of doing either one of those. Next slide, please. Okay, right now there's a federal program called Fresh Start. What that means is that you get into a program where you're no longer considered in default as far as the federal loans go, and you can stay in Fresh Start up until the August 30th of next year. If you want to get in Fresh Start, all you need to do is contact your servicer and use kind of magic language, but just say, I'd like to use Fresh Start to bring my loans back into good standing. There's some contact information on who you might contact. You can go online to do it. You can make a phone call, or you can mail in the request. Once you're in Fresh Start, you're no longer considered in default, and all the negative consequences, your bad credit report, the risk of having a debt collector, all of that puts you in a safe haven and you're no longer at risk for that. But again, that program will end August next year. If you have commercial FFEL loans, you need to go to the DRG phone number and ask for getting out a fresh start. But all the other loans that you have, the federal loans that you have, you just need to contact the contact information that I provided there. Next slide. Okay, so there's some forgiveness options. What that means is after a certain period of time, your loans are completely wiped out. As we saw before with some of the income-driven repayment plans, you can get total forgiveness at the end of 20 and 25 years, but these are plans that actually give you forgiveness in an earlier period of time. And there's several choices for that. You might have heard of the Public Student Loan Forgiveness Program, and I'll give you details about that. There's also total and permanent disability. Those are people who can no longer work. There's what they call a closed school discharge. That's where your school closed. You're in the middle of trying to get your degree and the school all of a sudden surprises you and closes and you're not able to complete your degree. So the federal government recognizes that puts you in a pretty difficult situation. So they offer discharge of your federal loans. There's what they call a false certification discharge. That's where if the school made you a false promise and you relied upon that, for example, they said, you know, this program is only going to take you 2 years, but it ends up taking you 4 years. Or they told you that everyone that graduates is going to be making $200,000 a year, and you graduate and you're struggling to get a job that pays more than $80,000 a year. So there's a process by which you can reach out to the federal government and ask them to discharge your federal loans. And then there's another application called the Borrower Defense to Repayment, and we'll talk about that next. Next slide, please. Okay, public student loan forgiveness. Been in the news a lot. What that requires is 4 things. And the 4 things have to be simultaneous. And I'll explain that. But you have to have the right type of loan. It has to be a federal direct loan. So the Parent Plus right now don't qualify until you consolidate. You have to be in an income-driven repayment plan. You have to work for a qualifying employer 30 hours a week minimum, and a qualifying employer is either working for the government or a nonprofit, a 501c3. When I say work for the government, that means any level of the government, the federal government, state government, local government. You can be a police officer, you can be a teacher, you can be a janitor at a nuclear facility run by the federal government. It doesn't matter what your position is at the employer. It just matters that the employer is either a government employer or a nonprofit. And then what you need to do is, while you met those 3 conditions, you have to pay off your student loan. So let's say, for example, you're not working for a nonprofit or the federal government, but you're paying for your student loans. You're not going to get credit for those payments towards public student loan forgiveness because you didn't meet the requirement that you had to be working for the government or a nonprofit. So you have to meet all 4 of these requirements. And if you do, then what is available to you is, after making 120 payments, or essentially 10 years, you can get your entire student loans forgiven. And that doesn't matter how much the remaining balance is. They will completely cancel the remaining balance. 120 payments and the working for a government or nonprofit doesn't have to be continuous. You can work 5 years and meet all 4 of these conditions. And during that 5 years, all those payments get credit. Let's say you decide to go then work for a private firm. You decide to go work for Microsoft or Apple Computer, which would not be a 501c or a government. And then you decide to go back and work for a nonprofit or the government. When you go back to working for the government or the 501c3, then you'll start to get credits for the public student loan forgiveness. Next slide. Okay, there is a specific program that is being available right now from the federal government. You may have heard of it. It's called the IDR account adjustment, income driven repayment plan adjustment. What that means is, if you have specific federal loans, the federal government is, without you even knowing it, going back and looking at your payment history. And if they find certain conditions, which I'll mention, they're automatically going to be giving you credit towards your public student loan forgiveness, because they recognize people were put in certain situations that was very detrimental to them, and they didn't realize that, and so they were not getting credit for your payment time. What are those conditions? So what they saw, the federal government saw that some people were being put in forbearance for long periods of time when they could have been put on an income-driven repayment plan and made very low or $0 payments and gotten credit towards public student loan forgiveness. So the conditions are, if you were in forbearance for a year or more, or for 3 years of accumulated forbearance, the federal government is giving you credit for during those time periods. They're also giving you credit if you paid less than a full payment. Like, let's say you were late 10 days, or you paid, $50 and you owed $80. They're going to be giving credit for all that time, as long as you had a direct student loan and you were eligible for income-driven repayment plan. That's happening now, this IDR account adjustment, and it's going to take time. What the federal government's trying to do is they're trying to adjust the accounts for those people that once they were adjusted, then their loans would be entirely forgiven. So they're kind of prioritizing it. So if you haven't seen an account adjustment, it should take until the end of 2024 is kind of their goal. But if you haven't seen it by the end of 2024, you might want to check in your studentaid.gov website, contact them, or contact a legal aid organization and ask whether they had done the income-driven repayment account adjustment or not, and you should get an answer. They will also, people who may be eligible for refunds. So if you have already paid off your student loans, there's a possibility you would get a refund for some of that time that you were steered into forbearance, and you should have really been offered an income-driven repayment plan. You can go to the studentaid.gov website, and there's a lot of information about how they're going to be taking care of this adjustment. I have to say, just like the Supreme Court decision that maybe a lot of you are aware of, some of those same people are attacking this. They don't like the fact that some of us with student loans are getting benefits associated with all the time that we've been paying our student loans. So there are attacks being made. You should watch the news, because they are trying to stop some of these credits for student loan borrowers. But right now, this is active. Okay, next page, next slide, please. Okay. Now I'm going to give you the opposite of what I just said earlier. So if you recall, I said that you could only consolidate once. Well, there's an exception. There's a special plan that's related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And what they've allowed is for people to consolidate one more additional time, as long as you consolidate before the end of this year, December 31st, 2023. And that will not affect the one-time consolidation that you get to do outside December 31st, 2023. And this will also allow, as I mentioned before, for the FEL type loans can be consolidated into direct loans. And again, this is a huge benefit, because as you probably got, it's complicated, I recognize that. Right now, commercial FEL loans, there's only one income-driven repayment plan available, and it's not the best payment plan. But if you have a commercial FEL loan and you consolidate before December 31st, you can consolidate that into a direct loan, and then you can take advantage of all the different income-driven repayment plans, including that SAVE plan, which will have your loans wiped away in 10 years. And this will also help and the other advantage of this one-time consolidation that's available up until the end of this year, it will allow you to consolidate, and you won't lose any credit that you've already received towards public student loan forgiveness. In the other consolidation option, if you consolidate, you can possibly lose credit towards all of the public student loan forgiveness payments that you made part of that 120 payments. So this one-time consolidation, if you're not sure that you should do it, you should reach out to legal aid, but mostly I can't see a downside to not considering this as an option. Next slide, please. Okay, if you are thinking of doing public student loan forgiveness, there's an application or a certification form that what I recommend to student loan borrowers is that you fill this out once a year, or if you change employers. The reason being is this form requires that your employer at the very end of the form to sign with a wet signature. It can't be DocuSign. It can't be a stamp. It has to be a wet signature, meaning somebody actually has to take a pen and sign that. So if you change employers, you want to do this at the end of your employment term, because especially with nonprofits, they often disappear. You can't find the people that you were working with and they've gone away. But you want to get the certificate, you fill it out. It's pretty simple to fill out. It just really wants to know how much time you worked for that employer, and if you were working 30 hours per week, so that they can see if you qualify for the public student loan forgiveness. If you fill out the form and you have your employer sign it, you then submit it to the studentaid.gov website. You can submit it by submitting the form through a PDF online. What that then does is you can then yourself go into the studentaid.gov website. At some point they process it. You can see the credit that you got for that time for the employer. If you don't change employers, you should still submit this form once a year, just so that you can see the accumulation of the credits of those 120 payments. You can see how close you're getting to forgiveness. I will say one huge caveat. If any of you are thinking of taking advantage of the public student loan forgiveness program, you must be working for a qualified employer when you make that last 120 payment and you submit the certificate. So don't make those 120 payments, retire, or go work for a profit company and then submit your certificate. You will not get the public student loan forgiveness. So what you want to do is, once you've made that 120 payment, work one more week for your employer, submit that certificate form, make sure that form is signed and into the federal government, and then you can leave the nonprofit government employer and you can be pretty certain you're going to get your loans forgiven. But please be sure you're working for one of those qualified employers before you submit, when you submit your final certificate. Next slide, please. Okay, there's also some very specialized forgiveness programs that allow specific employment status that will allow you to get some of your loans forgiven. One of those is if you're a teacher. But the teacher forgiveness program requires that you are teaching either in math or science, and they want you to be teaching in some sort of school, like an inner city school or rural, and they want you to do that for 5 years in a row. And if that is the case, you can have up to 17,500 of your student loans forgiven. If you don't teach math or science, then it's up to $5,000 forgiven of your federal student loans. And what they do is they scale that for each year. So it depends on, if you teach math or science only some of the years, then they're going to be scaling that 17,500 depending on the time that you actually teach math or science. So if you are a teacher and you want to see if you take advantage, you should go to that studentaid.gov website and see what kind of credit you can get. There's also specific programs for healthcare professionals. That's physicians, dentists, dental hygienists, and the like, nurse practitioners. If you practice for a minimum of 2 years, maximum of 4, you can get credit. You can get money back on your student loans. They kind of scale that too, where the first year you're working as a healthcare professional, you can receive $50,000 forgiven of your student loan debt. And then by the time you get to the 4th year, it's got down to about 10,000. You have to be practiced in a federally defined health professional shortage area. And you can again go on the this link here to see if one of your employers would qualify for that. If you do qualify, reach out and see if you can get some of the money taken off of your federal student loan debt. And again, this is for federal student loan debt. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to be talking about statutory discharge. Statutory discharge. Statutory is a word that means it's in the law. It's it's in the law, it's a given. There's not a lot of subtleties to it. So the first type of statutory discharge for your federal student loans, again, is what they call the closed school discharge. I mentioned that before. What that means, if you were enrolled in the school or you withdrew within 188 days of the school closing down. So let's say the school closed in June, but you withdrew in May, you would qualify because you kind of sense that things are falling apart, the teachers aren't showing up for class, the bookstore's closed. Sometimes you can get a sense when these schools are closing. You can fill out an application with the federal government and they will look at it and they will decide if your school closed on a specific date. They'll look what happened to you, and it's possible all the federal student loans that you took out during the time that you were enrolled in that school, that the federal government will wipe those student loans away. The other type of discharge is a false certificate discharge. That is when the school basically said to you, oh, don't worry, you don't need a high school diploma. And then you go to that school and you graduate, or you try to graduate, and they won't give you a certificate or a degree because they said, wait a minute, you should have had a high school diploma, or you have a felony. Suppose you have a felony when you start the college education, and then you are enrolled in a law enforcement program. And then when you try to get your degree, they say, wait a minute, you can't get a law enforcement degree, you have a felony. So it's any time that you were promised that you can get the degree, but they never told you that certain conditions that you met would have been excluded. So again, you can go on to the studentaid.gov website, find that false certification discharge, fill out the application, and the federal loans that you had, it's possible the federal government will say we're going to wipe them all out because essentially you were not told that you were never going to get the degree because you didn't meet certain preconditions. Okay. The third type of way of getting your federal student loans discharged is what they call total and permanent disability discharge. What that basically requires is that a medical professional state that you are no longer able to work, and it looks like that disability is going to be around for a while. Certain enrollments give you this automatically, such as if you're on SSI. What that means is if you find yourself in that position where you're not able to work, and it means that you cannot work at all, you can fill out that application and submit it to the studentaid.gov. And then all of the loans that you have will be discharged. All the federal student loans will be discharged because they recognize if you're not able to work, it's not very likely you're going to be able to pay off those student loan debts. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, then there's the fourth way of getting all of your federal student loans discharged. And that's if your school essentially lied to you. If they, like I mentioned earlier, if they made you a promise that the school was going to be guaranteeing a particular salary or guaranteed that you would have a job. Some of the cosmetic schools guarantee that when you graduate, they will find you placement, and you graduate and there's no jobs. So if you feel that you were made a promise that was turned out to be a lie or deceptive, and that impacted your ability to take advantage of the degree that you got from the school, you can again fill out this borrower defense application, and the federal government will look at the promises that were made to you and how the promises turned out to be a lie, and they could potentially discharge all of the federal student loans that you took out during the time that you were enrolled in that school. It's a fairly lengthy application. Do reach out to legal aid. We're all very experienced with helping student loan borrowers fill out this application because they really do want to see a promise and then how that promise turned out to be a lie. And sometimes it requires documentation, but we can help you gather the correct facts to show that you really do qualify for this. It takes a couple of months for this particular application because, again, they have to read a very detailed application and determine really where you lied to or not. But you can find this application on the studentaid.gov website, and there's plenty of legal aid people, as I said, that will help you submit a good borrower defense application. Next slide, please. Okay, now I'm going to talk about private student loans. We've talked a lot about some of the benefits of the federal student loans and how you can help yourself if you're struggling to make payments on those. We're going to go into the private loans, and as Daniel already mentioned, it's a little less option, but there are some options available if you have private loans. Next slide, please. Okay, private student loans are different in the federal student loans in one huge way. As I mentioned before, the federal government has the ability to automatically take your federal tax returns. They have the ability to take wage garnishment, and they can do that without much of a process whatsoever. It can just happen to you. But if you have private student loans, they have to go through a process of actually getting a lawsuit in order to get a judgment that requires you to pay off that debt. So yes, you have an obligation to pay off that debt, but if you become delinquent, it's a much slower process for them to get to the ability where they can actually take money forcibly from you. And that's called a judgment. Okay. So this is kind of the path here. It starts with delinquency. They would then charge off the debt, which means they basically say, we recognize we're not going to get this money back. They then sell the debt to a debt buyer, and the debt buyer files a lawsuit. If you see that a lawsuit has been filed against you because you've not paid off your private student loans, please immediately take care of that. You do not want a default judgment. A default judgment means that you didn't participate. The person came to court and said, you know, this person owes me money, and you didn't respond. So they get whatever amount of money they claimed was the amount owed. And maybe it wasn't the right number, or maybe there was some defense to that. So if you get a lawsuit filed against you, please, if you cannot figure out what to do, please reach out to legal aid as soon as possible. These judgments often require a very fast response time, less than a month. So you want to be sure that as soon as you become aware, generally, it has to be process served. That means someone has to actually come to your home and serve it to you. As soon as you get that, please pay attention. If you don't want to seek out legal aid, there's lots of online law librarians, regular librarians. They can actually help you find the correct forms, which is filing an answer to avoid that default judgment. Once you get a default judgment, then the sheriff can come and force collection on you, and you could lose assets. So I really urge you, if you do have a lawsuit, don't just bury your head in the sand. You do really need to answer. And there's lots of defenses to some of these. Once they get into debt collection mode, you may have some reasonable defenses to avoid having to pay the entire amount. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, and I wanted to go over some of your rights as debtors. We at HERA, we deal with a lot of consumer debt, and I want you to be aware that there's certain practices that people trying to collect that debt cannot engage in, and there's laws that protect you. And if you find that a debt collector has engaged in some of these bad practices, you really need to reach out to a legal aid or find a way to flag that they're misbehaving, so to speak. And you might have an ability to push back on the debt that they're saying that you owe them. Next slide, please. Okay, number one, do not give out sensitive information. As Daniel mentioned, if someone calls you on the phone, the first thing I would suggest is get off the phone. You don't want to give out any information like social security numbers, bank account numbers, identifying numbers. What you can say to them is, hey, I know you're trying to reach out to me. Please send me whatever you're trying to tell me in writing. The advantage of getting something in writing is now you have something that you can review. You have a documentation of what they're saying is the facts, rather than someone fastly speaking to you on the phone. You might not hear them properly. So just say, hey, I don't want you to contact me by phone. Please send me what you're trying to tell me in writing. But first and foremost, don't give out any sensitive information. Even your email address can be considered sensitive information. And then once you get any written allegation that you owe a debt, look at that debt. Does that debt make sense to you? I mean, you can look back at your payments that you made to your private student loans. And if it seems to be a number that doesn't make sense, you know, you might want to challenge that. You can challenge that. and say, I want you to tell me, how are you justifying that I really owe this kind of amount of money? Don't just accept that that dollar amount is necessarily the correct one, because keep in mind, the debt probably went from the original lender, the bank or whoever, the credit union, and then it went to a debt collector, and now somebody else is handling it. So it's gone through several hands, and some of the charges that they might be adding might not be valid charges. When you get communications from a debt collector, save all those records. If it's an email, if it's a text message, if it's a written, save those. You want to also save anything that you send to them. If you have conversations over the phone, write down when they called, the time they called, any notes that they said, any things that you felt was maybe a threat, or they told you owed a certain amount, or they're harassing you. Keep those records, because if you ever want to push back, all of that information is really useful and could possibly help you defend against false claims about the debt, or asking you to pay for things that you're really not obligated to pay. I know it's kind of old-fashioned nowadays, but it's important to open your mail. Much of the legal process relies on delivery by mail. And so you do want to make sure that you don't just ignore piles of mail, because if you do get correspondence, particularly if there's a lawsuit, often the court itself will send you documents in the mail if a court hearing has changed, or you have to be in court on a specific date. You do want to pay attention to your mail and save copies of that as well. And again, you definitely want to avoid that default judgment. Once you get a default judgment, you really have no defense as to whether that dollar amount was the correct amount, or whether they claim charges that were improper. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, as I mentioned earlier, if they phone you and you prefer not to speak on the phone, you can always tell them that. I don't want you calling me. I don't want you calling me, more than once a week. I don't want you calling me at all. Just send me letters. So you have certain rights as a debt collector. And keep in mind the things at the bottom here, these are mandated. They cannot get around that. They can't call you before 8 a.m. They can't call you after 9. They can't threaten you. They can't call your boss, friends, or neighbors and say, hey, Jamal owes $5,000. I'm trying to find him. That is illegal. They can say, hey, do you know where Jamal is? I need his address. Does he work for you? But they can't say they're calling because you owe a debt. They can't lie to you. They can't demand that you pay more money than you owe. And they can't add fees that are not authorized. And that's, again, why you want to avoid a default judgment, because the default judgment may incorporate all these unlawful fees. Next slide, please. Okay, as Daniel mentioned, or I have mentioned here as well, be very aware of your options in terms of paying back your student loans. If you're confused, which I have to grant you, this is a very complicated area, do reach out to legal aid or go to studentaid.gov, but do you want to avoid forbearance and deferments for extended period of time? Definitely use the income-driven repayment plan simulator, because the federal government will try to optimize the best payment plan for you. And also be aware that when you're in this forbearance and deferment, that you're going to have interest likely accumulating and adding to your debt. Okay, next slide, please. You want to be sure, as Daniel mentioned, with trying to manage applying for student loans, you should never pay anyone to help you with your student loan debt. Anyone who does that is trying to steer you away from the fact that there are so many free opportunities for you to get assistance, both the studentaid.gov, legal aid, our organization, HERA. We do not charge anyone who's seeking help trying to manage their student loan debt. Make sure if you feel pressured by anyone that raises your antenna, that there's something up here. Why are they pressuring me? Again, do not give credit card information. Don't get on any monthly payment plan where someone promises to help you with your student loan debt if you pay them a monthly fee. You do not need to pay for student loan debt relief. Okay. If you become delinquent, you want to immediately seek help with that, because at some point you can start getting your wages garnished, your tax benefits, as I mentioned. So you want to deal with all of these things as early as possible. If you're feeling overwhelmed, you've got a death in the family, I understand that. But as soon as you come up for air, you definitely want to reach out for services. Next slide, please. There with the private student loans, I have a lot of clients that come to me and they're having trouble with private student loans. You can refinance those student loans, and sometimes you can get a better interest rate. You do have to shop around with those. Sometimes credit unions have better rates, and even over time, sometimes the interest rates have gotten better than when you first took out that private student loans. So if you're feeling kind of overwhelmed with the private student loans, you might want to shop around legitimate organizations such as banks and credit unions and see if they can offer you a better rate. Keep in mind, though, you want to watch that it doesn't put you in a worse situation. And again, you can reach out to legal aids groups such as HERA. We can look at any proposed refinance and help you figure out if that's a really good option for you or not. Okay, next slide, please. Just a special note on bankruptcy. Yes, if you can, in some circumstances, get your student loans wiped out in bankruptcy, but there's certain very strict requirements. You have to show that you have an undue hardship. That means essentially that you really can't get by on a minimal standard of living, having to pay your student loan debt, and that this condition, whatever is causing you to have such a difficult situation, is likely to last a period of time. And you have to also show that you tried really hard to pay off the student loan debt. What I suggest is you go to a bankruptcy attorney. Don't try to do bankruptcy on your own, especially if you're trying to wipe out some of your student loan debt through the bankruptcy. And you can use bankruptcy to wipe out both federal loans and private loans. But this is a difficult standard to meet. And don't just look at bankruptcy as a likely or easy option for you. Please try to consider other ways of managing your student loan debt. Okay, next slide. Here are some options and some resources for you. I've mentioned some of them to you. As Daniel mentioned, you can go to HERA's website. We have some publications related to student loan debts. There's also, I want to say, the Project on Predatory Student Loan Lending. They keep tabs on private for-profit schools and some of the bad things they do. You may have read in some of the news, they've gotten some lawsuits where they've even won huge settlements for people at private schools, for-profit schools. So if you think you went to a private for-profit school, you might want to check on their website, because you may be involved. You might want to get involved in some kind of effort to get you debt relief. Okay, next slide, please. All right, Daniel's already shown you this. We offer quite an array of consumer debt assistance. So do reach out to HERA. We, as Daniel said, all our services are free except for estate planning, and that's a sliding scale. I want to give you guys time for questions, but you can go to our website. You can see a lot of these options, or you can call the number there and ask for an appointment. And one of the intake attorneys will see if you can have an appointment with an attorney. Nick, I think that's it. I'm open up to any questions.
You're welcome to unmute your mic and ask a question. I do see a question that Megan had written in the chat. Is there a statistic on successful forgiveness through PSFLF?
Yeah, I don't know now. When the previous administration, before President Biden took over, it was a very low rate. It was in the teens, and there was a lawsuit. It was called Betsy DeVos, because Betsy DeVos was the head of the Department of Education. And what that lawsuit claimed and showed was that administration, the previous administration, was actually making it as difficult as they could for student loan borrowers to take advantage of the public student loan forgiveness. So it was just a horrible success rate. I can't say now, because Biden's only been in president, a couple of years, but all I know is that all of the changes that he's made have actually made it easier to get forgiveness, and I haven't seen any current statistics. Good point, though. That's probably going to be coming out soon.
Great. Does anybody have any questions? Go ahead and unmute your mic. Okay, I think we are at the end of our presentation, and we're right at just a minute or two over noon. So I want to thank you all for coming and joining us today. And I also want to thank Mary and also Daniel for sharing all of their great information. We really appreciate you. If you have any questions in the future, I will be sending out links to the recording and resources. And of course, you can reach out to HERA directly.